Today you'll be learning about the New Deal, which was part of the Great Depression time period in the United States, focusing on the 1930s. And Standard 5-4.3 says, explain the American government's response to the Great Depression and the New Deal policies of President Franklin Roosevelt, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Social Security Act. This lesson is going to work differently than other lessons so far this year in that you are actually going to create a table to begin with. So copy the indicator down, and then I want you to create a table on the next page like the one that you see. You're going to create a table so that you will be able to record some information as we go through today's lesson. So your table should look like the one that I've just circled here. That way you can actually take your notes in a way that you can go back and study them later. So you're going to set up one column with the names of these programs or acts, and then you'll write out the full name. In the last column you'll explain the program or act in your words, and you'll make a connection. Think about something to today, maybe some example you've heard of these things mentioned in the news or at home or in a book you've read. So what was the New Deal? President Franklin Roosevelt proposed a wide range of programs called the New Deal, which focused on three goals: relief, recovery, and reform. We've talked about reform this year in our previous units about making change through reform. So the New Deal is going to work on reform, but also on two other efforts of relief and recovery. So let's take a look at what each of these mean. Relief programs set out to assist with the feeding and housing of the poorest American citizens. While these programs offered relief to some in the short term, they had little lasting impact on the economy. These things were the immediate acts that the government went into to try to help people. Recovery programs' purpose was to put money into the hands of consumers and thus help businesses to recover. If people don't have money, can they spend it? Well, no. So this allowed for an immediate effect, but it wasn't very big of an immediate effect. Some people say that the New Deal programs, as far as recovery, didn't do as much as the government had hoped at that time. It was actually the military spending for World War II that put people back to work. So this is an important point for you to keep in mind, in that these programs didn't necessarily end the Great Depression. And then lastly, reform programs attempted to change the system and prevent the conditions that caused the Great Depression. So reform, remember, if we talk about things from earlier this year, I'm going to use an example such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, where they tried to put safe procedures in for the handling of food and medicines. That was to cause a change so that food would be handled properly, and the things that happened, for example, in the meat packing plants wouldn't happen again. So reform programs think about change. So let's look at some examples of what these were. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a relief program designed to provide young men who were roaming the countryside in search of work the opportunity to build parks and plant trees. The CCC could also be considered a recovery program. So the Civilian Conservation Corps actually was responsible for one thing local that I'll mention, in that Kings Mountain National Military Park was actually built because of the CCC. That park went into existence during this time period and was created by those unemployed that were looking for work. The CCC could be considered a relief program as well as a recovery program, and that it provided immediate relief to the country because it did put people to work, and it was trying to fix some of the issues in the economy so people could earn money and help their families survive. This here needs to be considered something that you write into your own words. So this information is something I would write into my chart. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, attempted to reform the system of rent, the conditions that caused the Great Depression. The FDIC helped to restore and maintain confidence in the banking system and prevent runs on the banks because the government insured the deposits of investors. Roosevelt felt that the public view of the banking industry was demoralized, and it was essential to restore confidence in the financial system. The FDIC works to fix the problem of low confidence in banking. I want you to think about something. For these people living during this time period, they had went to the banks, they had deposited their money, and they expected it to be there in safekeeping. The same thing that we do today. I put money in the bank, I expect that my money is going to be there when I need it. Because of the practices of banks loaning out money and loaning out more money than they really should have at that time and making risky loans, they didn't have those depositors' money. So the FDIC was an insurance policy for consumers. I want you to think about particularly this word if it can help you remember it. Insurance. You insure something to protect it. So that way, in this case, to protect people's money. This is another section that you should be thinking about how to write it in your words. Social Security was also designed to reform the system that ensure that the disabled and the elderly would have some income and that the unemployed were protected against layoffs. Workers in agriculture and domestic service, which employed many African Americans, were not covered. Social Security had no immediate impact in ending the Depression and offering relief to those who suffered as a result of it. However, it has provided a secure retirement for many citizens and significantly reduced poverty among the elderly since that time. So this was a reform system, so it was meant to make change to avoid problems again, and it affects two groups of people: disabled, so those who are unable to work physically, and then also the elderly. Many of you may actually know people that have retired and draw Social Security, and that's how they survive. That's what they use to pay their bills, to buy their food. That's the money that they're using to live on, is Social Security. However, if you were an African American working as a farmer, you were not eligible for Social Security. So kind of once again in history, for African Americans, they faced a challenge in this, and that if they were working a domestic or an agriculture-based job, then they wouldn't be covered by Social Security. It didn't have an immediate impact. It didn't help immediately, but did help over the long term. So it wasn't necessarily something that provided relief immediately, but it did help over time. This is another section that you need to think about how to put it into your words. A couple points to make as you think about that are the people it impacted and the people that it didn't help. Finally, Roosevelt also lobbied for Congress to establish new regulations on the financial sector of the economy. Congress created the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. For my college sports fans, this is not the SEC that you may be thinking of. The SEC was used to regulate trading on Wall Street and curb out-of-control high-risk investments that had led to the crash of 1929. There's a note here that says students should be able to describe how the role of the federal government greatly increased as a result of the New Deal response to the Great Depression. Some of the programs of the New Deal, such as Social Security and the FDIC, are still in use today. So I I put this note in here for you to think about, in that this is kind of what I want to talk about for just a second. The government steps up during this time period in history and starts passing acts and laws and creating commissions to try to protect the well-being of the citizens of the United States. This is another example of that, in that they were with the SEC during the 20s. People were going to the bank, they would borrow money, and then they would take that money they borrowed and buy stocks. So they were borrowing money to buy stocks, so they didn't really own anything. The SEC actually watches trading of stocks, so that way there is some security and protection in the buying and selling of stocks, so that we don't see a crash like the one that took place in 1929. And some of these programs still exist today and are benefiting citizens in the United States, such as Social Security and the FDIC. For instance, if you walk into a bank, a lot of times you will see a little plaque that will say FDIC somewhere within that bank, and it's just showing that your money is insured through the FDIC. So all of these programs in the New Deal work to try to help Americans by providing relief and recovery and reform over a long period of time.